there are so many of our stories that haven't been told yet. So I didn't feel restrained or constrained. I just felt that I needed to get this right. I wanted the story to be authentic.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Conversation with Nadine Matheson podcast. As always, I hope that you're well and you've had a good week. I'm not too bad, getting over a cold. It seems like the minute I decided to stop and take a break after finishing my book, my body decided this is the perfect time to completely shut down. So that's what happened to me. So I'm finally over a cold. Thank God for that. And I've been slowly getting myself back into the swing of things. And right now in the United Kingdom, we are more than halfway through Black History Month. Now, if you follow me on Instagram, you would have seen that every day of October, I'm recommending a book by a Black author. And we're going through all the genres. So you've got books by thriller authors, romance, YA. And I just think it's really important to remember that a Black author is not just for October, that Black authors, they need to be celebrated 365 days of the year. And during this conversation that I have with the author, Anne Hawke, you will hear my shock when we start discussing the small, and I mean the minute number of books that are published. And I mean traditionally published, not self-published. The small amount of books, tiny amount of books that are traditionally published by Black authors in the United Kingdom. To say it's ridiculous is an understatement. It is ridiculous. So when you are out in your local bookshops and you're browsing the bookshelves, don't forget, look for a book by a Black author and share it with your friends. Anyway, let's get on with the show. As I said, today I'm in conversation with author Anne Hawke, and in our conversation we talk about being focused on chasing the dream, the different points of views in the Windrush story, and how she felt when her novel was sent to a publisher without her knowledge. Now, as always, sit back, we'll go for a walk and enjoy the conversation. Anne Hawke, welcome to the conversation.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here.
I'm very glad to have you here. So my first question for you is, when you finished your debut novel, So the Pages of the Sea, what was your intention for the book? What was you looking for?
I started this book as a chronicle of childhood. I was looking to chronicle a type of childhood that was once quite commonplace, even for young kids, whereby they had a certain amount of autonomy over how they spent their own free time. And part of that was just trying to capture that feeling for these two cousins, in the end they turned out to be, who very much liked to just wander about, do their own thing, and as long as their chores were done at home, they kept each other company. They fell out an often a lot. So that was my intention initially. And then obviously I had to set them in a context. And that context became that of a child left behind. The protagonist, Wheeler, had been left in the home of her cousin by a parent who had gone to England to find work. So essentially, this was a particular story of a child's experience of living in a community where someone had gone away and become part of the Windrush generation. In response to that aspect of the novel, I was very surprised by the reaction from both the Caribbean community here and people outside the community who said to me they had never wondered. They were surprised by their own lack of curiosity about where people came from. So that started conversations for people. And of course, there are other aspects of being a left behind child that came up from people within the diaspora who had had a similar experience. So this story about one child left behind, and she was actually left behind. She has two sisters, and they're very much part of how the story unfolds, but this story resonated with people at various levels, which was pleasantly surprising.
It even like resonates with me because I think in the sense that I think when you're a child or, you know, so we were talking earlier, like my parents are from Grenada and you're from Grenada. And when you're when you're the children of those parents and you know their history. So I know that my mum and dad, for both of them, they were those left behind children, but you never saw that. You never saw it as being abandoned. It's just, that's just the way it was. They were young, maybe 5 and 6, and their parents, everyone's parents did it. They went to England first to look for work, to sort themselves out. And they left the children with aunts and uncles, well, and grandparents in the majority of cases. I think even with my dad, it wasn't just him and his younger brother. It was him and his younger brother and his cousins left with their grandparents, and the grandparents raised them. And then then one day at the age of 14, 16, you get a plane ticket and you're told to get on a plane and go to London to join your parents. And growing up, that wasn't an unusual story to hear.
Yeah, I think it was a common enough experience. And in a way, I think the outcomes were predominantly good. I don't want to generalize. However, there was a slightly another side to that I hadn't anticipated. A number of people came up to me at a recent event I had, and not just come up to me, but during the Q&A, aired some very upsetting feedback about not being left, not the experience of being in the Caribbean, but it was arriving here and the impact of that separation from their parents. The fact that there was a lot of anger, a lot of hostility on the part of some of those kids, and a lot of negative interactions with siblings who had subsequently been born in the UK. And there was that tension in the family, and a lot of it unacknowledged by their parents. So you've got people who, even as adults now, feel a rift, feel a separation from their own siblings because of stuff that had gone on way back when they first came to England, and the sense that, I don't know, they felt abandoned to some extent. And meanwhile, their siblings here felt, well, we didn't do anything. It wasn't our fault that you were left. So it's been a very curious mixture of responses and emotions, and some people have described themselves as having a kind of lifelong trauma. And a lot of, I'm sorry to say, it seems as if the book has triggered things for certain people, maybe even things that have been buried, but hopefully now it's fostering conversations about this.
Did it trigger anything for you and your family?
I don't think it did. I think for us that I think the predominant thing for us was trying to reestablish familial bonds. And I think it was less complicated because my mother didn't have any additional kids while she was away. Yeah. So it wasn't a familiar experience at all. And I wasn't prepared. I hadn't expected this type of strong reaction from not everyone, but a certain sector of the audience. It took me by surprise.
I was thinking, because when I look back at my parents, they thought, like, I can put my dad into one category where he came and it's him and his brother just joining his mum in London. But my mum's the other category where I said someone sends you a ticket and you're at the airport and then you land in England, and she arrived home. But then she's then arrived into this new home, but into another family because now she has sisters.
How did she cope with that? Because that's very much the type of family pattern these people came from. I
think she can't, when I talk to her and talk to my aunties and stuff, because we're all very close. So I think with her younger cousins, her sisters, it's the excitement of having a big sister. So there's that. And then for her, she is the big sister, like probably the big sister. And she's there. So the unit it knitted together, which is lucky in her circumstances. But I can understand in other families where it's not going to be so easy. And there is probably going to be resentment and hostility there. And also a lot of anger, because whatever way you look at it, whatever way you spin it, let's break it down to basics. There is that you left.
Yes.
You went off and left me. And I say from 6 to 16, 10 years, that's a long time. You're developing, you're growing, you're learning about yourself and learning about families.
Yeah. And I think, again, the thing that differs from this in this book from other books that have spoken about the Windrush experience is that it tells a story from over there. I think all the other books I can think of, Small Island and a few other books have been mentioned to me. It's a perspective from an adult perspective from arriving in England. And this opens a window on a world. Yeah, it's the world the Windrush generation left behind. And I was particularly determined to give a view into that world, a world I thought had a lot of joy to offer, a lot of customs, a lot of celebrations that people may not have been aware of. So it wasn't simply the case that the Windrush generation left and life stopped. Life continued, and there, to a great extent, lies the interest, if you like, for a lot of people who hadn't thought of the migration story in that way. They predominantly thought in terms of the arrival, but not necessarily what was left behind. And I think a lot of the book takes place in the Caribbean. And in terms of what it chronicles, I think it's a necessary part of the story because these communities missed those who were abroad. And there isn't a conversation that the central character has, which doesn't in some way reference the absence of her mother, but ultimately a lot of other people were having that experience. And I think it impacted the community, but obviously life went on, and there was still there's a lot of humor in the book. There's a lot that focuses on what the conventions were at the time, what was considered appropriate in terms of behavior and what is expected of these children. So from that perspective, I think it offers something in addition to this mosaic of who we are and where we came from, in addition to what we know about the experience in the UK.
I was just thinking, when you look back and you're watching like documentaries about Windrush or whatever news reports, or they're speaking to the Windrush generation, I think there's always been a slight disconnect for me because I know like the Windrush generation, like I know that my grandparents and my great uncles and stuff, I know they didn't come on the Windrush. They came on a different boat. So you've got...
Okay.
This is the thing, This is the thing, because you always hear it's the Windrush. But I'm like, well, I know they did not come on that boat. And even one of my older cousins who's passed now, like he tells his story, of being, I can't remember what the boat was called, but he described being on this boat, and it described it as being like on a cruise, and then how he had to stop off at different islands and also around Europe before he even finally got to London. So there's always been that slight disconnect, but also knowing that this is not how my parents got here. Like they didn't get here on the boat. They came on a plane and they met their family. And I think sometimes with the Windrush story, it can get a bit, what's the word I'm looking for? It's quite contained, when really it's much more vast than this one boat that arrived in Tilbury Docks in, I can't remember what year it was, but yeah, it's more than that.
48.
54? Oh, 48, I know that's why. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's more than that.
So I suppose what we're saying is we need more stories.
Yeah, we definitely need more stories.
Yeah, because very much now, the story that you've just described, the one we're all told, is very much pathé news, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
It has none of the complexities that already you've identified. It has, to my mind, it's not even fully representative of the people who came subsequently, even if they didn't come by plane. A lot of them came on banana boats. And that's what's referenced in the book, because that too went from island to island, stealing people, if you like, sweeping them up. And that was a regular occurrence. So I think we need more stories.
We do. When did you know that you could tell stories? When did you recognize that ability in yourself?
I've always loved to read. I think someone else recognized that in me. One of my English teachers. It's funny you should ask that. I think I was in secondary school, and this teacher said something very profound to me, and I wasn't aware of it. I used to write a lot of poetry, and yes, so it came from that. So let's just say it emboldened me to branch off into short stories and so on. Yeah, I think I started life as a poet and subsequently became short story writer, and then just kept pushing myself like you do if you run on the track and then decide you want to be a marathon runner. So that's what I wanted to do subsequently, and ultimately was to write novels, yeah.
Did you ever feel that you would have any constraints in the sort of stories that you could tell?
No, I never felt constrained. I mean, I'm always facing that reality, which I think we all do as writers of colour, in wanting to tell the stories, wanting to tell our stories, and feeling very privileged in a way, because there are so many of our stories that haven't been told yet. So I didn't feel restrained or constrained. I just felt that I needed to get this right. I wanted the story to be authentic. Occasionally I read stuff about us, about people in the diaspora, people from our backgrounds, and it doesn't ring true. So the only constraint, if you like, were the ones I put on myself, the pressures I put on myself. For instance, I was adamant that I needed the spoken word of the Caribbean to be true. I didn't want to end up with a book where characters didn't really feel as if they would have said those words. I also wanted the reader to be immersed in that world. So I had to use Caribbean English. So the book is written on these 3 levels, whereby you have this child's inner world, which is communicated to you via Caribbean dialect. Her spoken words are communicated via Caribbean dialect. And in acknowledgement of the fact that everybody, more or less, is able to comprehend standard English in the Caribbean. But it's not the other way around, isn't true. I then have this narrator who very much collaborates with Wheeler to tell this story. And the narrator acts as an interpreter. And I think at times, I can't really judge, but I think at times it gets to the point where the universal reader probably thinks they can speak Caribbean dialect because they have immediate access to what's going on via this narrator. So, yeah, it's a very interesting mixture, and I'm very happy to say people have appreciated it. There's an audiobook that's read by Saffron Kumba, and that's one of the things people say straight away about her interpretation of the book. She gets that. You really feel that combination of the 3 levels going on and happening. And it's not only authentic and immersive, it's very immediate. You almost think you're on the back of Wheeler, following things as they happen in real time. Yeah.
The only reason I was laughing, because you were talking about, how in the Caribbean they can understand standard English, but then it doesn't necessarily work the other way around. And the reason why I was laughing, I just had this memory of being in court. And it wasn't my witness. It wasn't my witness. It might have been the prosecutor's witness. And he was Jamaican. And he started talking. And sometimes it would be normal. I say normal English, then it will break off into patois. And I can't remember if it was the judge or the prosecutor, like during the break. And I was like, but Nadine, you're from the Caribbean. You obviously you understand what he's saying. I'm like, no, because Grenada patois, Jamaican patois is not the same. Obviously, I understand what he's saying. to an extent. But you can't assume that there's a universal Caribbean language, there's a universal patois, because as you know, in Grenada and Dominica, I think St. Lucia as well, it's broken French. So if my mum started speaking patois up there, you wouldn't have a clue. It just made me laugh when I thought about that.
I'm glad you said that, oddly enough, because there is that assumption, and it speaks to the fact that people do not understand the origins of those dialects. They don't understand that these came about in response to, the wholesale erasure of people's languages of origin. And what subsequently came about because of people not being able to speak, not being allowed to speak their own languages, for fear of the consequences, if you like, of them plotting against the overseers and so on. Everyone had to speak English, but they're all in different places, weren't they? So the forms of dialect and the accents and so forth that subsequently evolve are incredibly local to the people who spoke that way. And it's their heritage. I mean, they've handed it on. And it's extraordinary to hear different versions of this. You know, the Guyanese don't sound anything like the Bajans, who don't sound anything like Trini. So it's inventive, it's beautiful, it's jeweled, it's nuanced, it's complicated. And then you have this additional tier whereby people and linguists suggest that a lot of what happened is they brought some of the words in to identify some of the vegetation that looked vaguely familiar to stuff at home. So then you have this other layer, and I want to describe where in the Caribbean, they've got different names for different vegetables because those are the names they attach to those vegetables in Jamaica as opposed to in Grenada and so on. So if you're outside of that, and no wonder the judge and others thought, well, it's all one language. Of course you understand it.
It's even I take it down to basics. Like in Grenada, we call, so we say fried bakes, right? And in Trinidad, they might just say bakes. Whereas in Jamaica, it's fried dumplings. You're like, no, it's not fried dumpling, it's fried bakes. So we all have our different. Yeah, it's quite different. It does amuse me because we have to explain we're not just, it's not a monolith. It's not these islands are in a chain, but they're all really unique in their own ways. When it comes to language, even the way how foods are cooked, it's so unique.
And in their customs as well. I'm fairly sure that people from Jamaica first encountered carnival here in the UK. They might be different now. There was no tradition in Jamaica for carnival.
No. Carnival is very much, I'll say, Trinidad and
it's gravitated out to everybody else. Yes, so it's not a monolith, and it couldn't be. And I think that's obviously the case for historical reasons. And increasingly, it's a beautiful thing to see people in the region of the Caribbean embracing what I call their mother tongue, rather than the situation that once was, where people weren't always so proud to use the dialect that had been given to them. They felt almost as if they would be deemed to be unintelligent or uneducated. So I think now there's a lot of pride, is the word for it, in knowing where those languages came from. And I think it's possibly part of decolonizing the region, decolonizing one's culture, to now point to this as a plus.
It probably explains when we're talking about languages why, because my mother speaks Patois, and she used to basically tell us off in Patois, all the time. So you knew when you was being told off, and she'll speak in Patois. But my grandmother, her mum, used to say to her, "Don't talk to the children in that old language. Don't teach them that language." Yeah. And when you think, now you're saying it, they might be thinking, if you're speaking this language that no one else understands in England, it might be that it is a sign of saying, you're not intelligent, you're not smart, or maybe being lazy, not wanting to speak the Queen's English. But now the reverse is happening, where people want to speak Patois and they encourage them to speak Patois. When you go to the schools, especially in Carriacou, in the nursery school, they have like the numbers, you know, you do your 1s to 10s and your alphabets. They have it written in English and in patois as a mural outside. So there's like a reverse going on now.
Interesting. Yeah. It's funny that you should mention that in context of Carriacou. I've heard that said about, there have been surveys in Jamaica where people have actually said they'd like it to be taught in the schools alongside standard English. So obviously that sentiment is elsewhere as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I always like to ask, who was Anne Hawke before she became Anne Hawke, the author?
It's a good question. I used to teach for a long time in secondary schools here in London. And so I've always written, but obviously I had to make a living, and you have to. And I'm sure we'll get onto that in a moment about publishing in general. So that's who I was. And for a while, I was also a paralegal. And very long, and I used to do some journalism as well. So that's who I was. But I think I was always the writer. I think that everything else was the practical side of living, and making sure that you didn't have a situation where you felt you had made a wrong choice, if you like. You didn't miss out on anything else because you were overly focused on chasing a dream, put it that way.
Did it always feel like a dream, though? Or did you know it was attainable?
I've gone through various phases. I don't know about you. I think at one point it may have seemed as a dream to me. And I think over time it hardened up into a reality when I had confidence in my own ability to recognize the strength in my work. So I'm deeply critical of my own work, not in a negative sense. I don't focus on negativity, but I'm very much aware that I don't see myself as sending out work that I don't think is ready to go out. I don't put work out there in the hope that someone else will guide me and say, well, you need less of that and more of that. So I've always been on a journey of discovery, if you like, and trying to lessen the distance between my aspirations and my output, because I always knew what I wanted to do. And with this book, I knew I'd achieved it. I was chasing something magical with these two kids, a type of childhood, as I say, and a place with these amazing customs and practices and these people. And ultimately, I felt I'd done them justice, yeah.
How long did it take you to write The Pages of the Sea? Because you said it wasn't like you're seeking perfection, but you want to make sure it's right and it's ready to go. How long were you writing it for?
Interesting question. I would say this version of the book took me 4 years. Okay. Really? I started writing the book. I had a lot of other characters. I had various scenarios. And as I said, I knew what I wanted. So I was committed to pursuing that. And I had it all mapped out and ready to go in 2018. I think that's a good time to say. It's sort of the end of 2018, 2019. And so I wrote away at that. And then along came COVID. So I had most of the book written out and I knew where it was going because I had it planned out and mapped out. And at the end, I think it was sort of July time, we were still in lockdown. I had this conversation with myself and I said to myself, basically, do you know everything yet? Do you need help with craft? And I thought it was a question I posed to myself and I decided I might want to do an MFA. So I thought, I'm going to test this out. So I contacted Toby Litt, who is currently Professor of Creative Writing at Southampton University, but at the time he was at Birkbeck College. And so I wrote to him and sent him, I think it was the first 3 chapters and a proposal, which was what was required for the program. And he got back to me he got back to me fairly quickly and he said, let's have a conversation. I said, okay. So we had a chat on Zoom. He said, I'm going to make you an offer, an unconditional offer, but don't come on the course. I said, you don't need to come on the course.
He told you not to come?
Yeah, you don't need to come on the course, he said. Just carry on doing what you're doing. And when you've written the best version of this book that you're happy with, contact me and I'll help you to find an agent.
Did that surprise you?
It shocked me. It did shock me. It didn't, because I've always written in isolation. So it was useful to get someone else's perspective on what I was doing. But I trusted myself. He said other things subsequently to shock me, but that didn't really shock me. It just enabled me to carry on doing what I was doing. So that happened. And subsequently other things happened.
So going back to Toby Lee, you said there are things that didn't shock you. What did shock you? What did he say that shocked you, if you can say?
Yeah, well, we then went on. He said, get back, and I took my time. And about 15 months went by, and I finished the book, and I redrafted the book. And I know a lot of people get frustrated at that prospect, but I don't mind redrafting. I don't know about you, Nadine. I can always see something. I can always, I'm impressed by the fact that you think you're done and then you can see something. So I wasn't totally put off.
You're never done.
Exactly. You got to step away after a while, but it wasn't in any way obsessive. And so I was done in about 15 months after he and I had that chat. And I sent him the book and nothing happened. I thought, okay, this is interesting. So nothing happened. And I think I sent the book out in July. And I thought, okay, then what can you do? And I waited. And then in the autumn, he got back and he said, you sent it to my academic email. I wasn't there in the summer.
Oh.
I've really just seen it. So.
You know, when you're saying it now, it just seems so practical. Like, well, of course not, because I have my my law school email, and I barely look at it when it's not term time. I am not looking at it. So if you don't send it to my personal one or my Nadine Matheson, my author one, then whatever goes there, it's just going to stay there until now. But now you're like, well, of course, yeah.
So that's where it stayed. And it stayed there. And he then saw it in the autumn and he said, I really like the book. He says, it's good. It's more or less, I don't know what he'd expected, but he was very pleased with the book and said, yes, definitely. He has an agent in mind and he's going to contact this person. And so we had a really nice conversation and a lot of stuff came up in that. And I think we became friends over the course of those conversations. And Toby is this incredible writer himself. So it always makes a difference when you are speaking with a like mind. And he's incredibly knowledgeable. Anyway, we had this conversation. And we were on the Zoom for about an hour. And towards the very end, he said, and by the way, I think we had about 5 minutes left. He said, I sent you a book to this friend of mine, Neil Griffith, at Weather Glass Books. He says, from time to time, he asks, if I've got any student work that I think looks promising and might be suited to their particular publishing house. And I said, okay, that's interesting. He said, and by the way, he wants to publish your book. I thought, what? So I had this moment, if you like, sort of cognitive dissonance, just like cognitive dissonance. What is this? What? I'm supposed to wait. You're supposed to have an agent first, and then you get published. So I was being completely spun around. I couldn't get my head around what was being said. But he says, you don't have to make any decisions. He just wants to talk to you. I thought, bloody hell, it's a publisher. He wants to talk to me. So should I let him have your email? I said, of course, let him have my email. So that then led to a conversation. So that was the most surprising thing that happened. That was a total shock.
Listeners, it's time for a very short break. If you're enjoying this conversation with Nadine Matheson and want to help keep the podcast going, why not buy me a cup of coffee? Your support goes such a long way in keeping these conversations flowing. Just check out the link in the show notes. Because you were saying, this is how I'm interpreting it, that you know how you want your book to be. You have so much control over it in that respect. Mm-hmm. You've worked on it for years. When it then gets to the point, and also you know what the process should be. You finish the book, it goes. You submit to agents. You hope you get an agent, and then you hope you get a publisher. Did you ever at any point feel a way about the fact that that step in the journey has been interrupted and someone else has taken over because they've sent their book? They sent your book that you have control of to a publisher. Didn't you feel like, oh, it's good, but hold on a second?
No, I never felt that because, and I know there's so much that has changed in publishing over the years, but I never submit to a publisher because again, you're warned against it, or you used to be, that it will just end up in the slush pile. Don't bother doing it. You need an agent to act on your behalf with a publisher. So I didn't feel deprived of any of the stages or any of the steps. I just thought, wow, this can happen. This is a thing. I didn't know that I could get a publisher. And I think the situation, I think it was unique in as much as I was in contact with someone who, as a professor of creative writing with a reputation in that field, is himself approached by publishers. And I think possibly approached by agents as well. Hence his confidence that he sort of knew the type of agent that might be interested in handling me and looking at my books. So I didn't feel in any way that anything was taken away. I just thought, wow, this is what's happening now, or this can happen. I didn't know it was possible. That's all.
Is there anything that has surprised you about publishing now that you're in it?
I read some statistics the other day that knocked me sideways. I thought, wow, okay. Something along the lines of 160,000 books are published each year. 160,000 in the UK. And less than 100 are by people of colour. And I was like, whoa, that's what we're up against.
100?
Yeah, less than 100.
Out of 160?
160,000,
yeah.
160,000, yeah.
I
couldn't get my head around it.
Break it down.
I don't want to go to the percentile thing. I think that's
only like 0.0016%.
And this was certainly true as of 2016. It's from the bookseller. So I'm not sure if things have improved post George Floyd. I don't know. I couldn't find anything more up to date. And I tell you this, I think in a way, I mean, if you want to talk about publishing, I mean, there have been twists and turns in that industry, commitments to diversity and what seems to have turned out to be short-term initiatives and mentoring and so on. I don't know enough of that world to speak definitively on what's going on. But that was a shocking statistic. And what I will say, as well as that, is the fact that I know I'm a reader. I read and I love things that are surprising and strange. I don't think you just read to see yourself reflected in stories. So I almost feel as if the public is being let down. I think that people want stuff that they can't find. So to assume that people outside the Black experience aren't interested in the Black experience, I think is possibly a mistake. I don't think it's necessarily the case that people are frightened off by reading something. I wouldn't even say challenging. I mean, we are people of colour. We read all the time. And bear in mind, most of the stuff we read isn't reflecting us. There's something there in the human spirit that reaches out and wants to know about how other lives are led. So I think that there isn't necessarily a lack of interest on the part of the public, but it's like everything else in society. I think publishing just reflects the society in which it's in. You don't have a great number of people of colour who are published. You don't have a great deal of people of colour who are, I don't know, football managers. It goes on and goes on and goes on. So I think in a way, publishing possibly reflects that disparity? I do not know. But the statistics did shock me.
The football thing always surprises me. I'm like, look how many black footballers on the pitch. And look how many, if you can count, I don't think you can even count it. Well, you can count it on one hand, how many football managers are of colour in the Premier League or the Championship. It's just, that's ridiculous. But then also what you talk, I think it's two-pronged in the sense that you both want to see yourself reflected in books, in the sense that you want to see yourself in a story, but you also want to see yourself reflected in the sense of the author who's written the story. You want to see that it's an author of colour. And then sometimes because sometimes there are people who are telling, and I'm saying black stories in quotes, they can't see me, but I'm saying, but they're not written by people of colour. And that's happened. I mean, if I think of one, like James Patterson, who writes the Alex Cross series, thrillers. And for years, when I first started reading this, but it features a black character. And for years, I thought, well, this James Patterson geezer, he must be black. And then you learn that he's not. And I think sometimes you can feel a bit of a frustration when you're like, but there are authors of colour who are more than capable of writing about a black detective and doing a ridiculously long series and continuing to write these stories. Because sometimes there has been that disconnect. And then also as well, it goes back to, when you always hear about the gatekeepers in publishing, there is a block, someone dictating is what they think the black story is or what a person of colour's story is and what the readers want to read. But so there's a great disconnect there.
It's curious because this particular series seems to have gripped you, and in a way it was immaterial to you who wrote it? Or did the character seem authentic to you?
I think because they're American characters, so you kind of, and I'm British, so you kind of say take it as read. So you've already got that. You already got that kind of disconnect there. You kind of take it as read, but then you just assume it's a black character. It must be black. It has to be a black person writing this book, and it wasn't. And I still feel a bit put out by that.
Okay.
This was I can't remember when I first read that book. Along Came a Spider. We're talking late 90s, maybe early 2000s. Yeah, see, I can still feel a bit put out by it. But I'll tell you what I love to see now. You're talking about in 2016, and we got this silly percentage, 0 point whatever it is, of books being written by people of colour in 2016, and we're not so sure what the numbers are now. In 2024, 8 years later. But I could say from being published in 2021 to now, there seems to be more authors of colour being published. But also they're not just telling that one type of story, which I think is always important. They're not just telling that one type of story. And then even looking at us, there's me and there's you and there's the author Jacob Ross. And I'm thinking, we're all from Grenada and we've all written our stories, our books are published. And I think that's amazing as well. See?
Absolutely. I think that for me, I know as a reader, as I said, I like to know that there is something that can still surprise me or something that can grip me that doesn't necessarily have to be my own story. So there is that aspect to it. I think one of the things that has struck me, I may, again, it's purely observational, is that it's one thing to get published, it's another to be supported and promoted. So I think certainly in the type of writing I do, I don't know if the paucity of images and the apparent lack of prominence of people being championed by booksellers, or for instance, my book, I've never seen it anywhere in a window. and I've never seen it on display, say, at Waterstones or anywhere like that. Though, in Defense of Waterstones, I've actually been featured on one of their debut panels. So I had a lovely experience there with a very appreciative audience. And I think it was a week after my book was released, or just before it was released. But yeah, I think there is that follow-on that maybe needs to happen and isn't happening just at the moment. And it could just be because it's such a crowded field. I mean, loads of books come out every month, every week practically. But I do think that if you are a writer who isn't of the mainstream, I think it helps to be given the opportunities that other people are having in proportion, if you like, to your presence. I think that we can be very easily crowded out of the landscape because there are so few of us. So it would be nice, I think, as well as being published, to be promoted a little more, and just to have a little more visibility would help. Because the danger is then that people will say, well, it doesn't sell, see? Why publish them? Nobody wants it. Well, you can't buy what you don't know is out there. If you don't know it's out there, how are you going to purchase it?
Exactly. And you can see my face, and I was trying not to pull faces because I'm like, hold on a second. This is like ridiculous. Because I read The Guardian review.
Thank you.
And it wasn't, yeah, well, this is the thing, right? Because it wasn't a review where you're like one of four. You know what I mean? It's like a collation of books. Mm-hmm. It was just about your book, your debut. And it's in The Guardian. And most people kill to get, I've never been reviewed in The Guardian, so most people's going to kill to get a review in The Guardian, because that means hopefully you're being seen. But it's crazy to think that you can write this amazing book, have an amazing debut, get recognised in The Guardian newspaper, appear on Woman's Hour, to have your debut panel, but then you're saying you haven't seen it in a window. Have you actually seen it in a book? Sure.
No, I haven't. I can't pretend to have done.
See, that's crazy.
Right across London, but I haven't. And equally, I mean, I'm not saying that people have an obligation to invite me to their festivals or anything, but I haven't had any of those sorts of invitations. So it's an interesting paradox where you say that people aren't buying these books, but you're not actually giving them access to these books. They're not going to go into, to the desk and ask you to go around the back and see if you've got a copy of this, because they need to know it's there. You need to actually give them the access.
This is the thing, like, we can bang on as much as we like about, you want to see yourself seen in books, either internally or on the cover. But the long and the short of it is, it doesn't really make a difference if no one's prepared to put your book on the bookshelves and put them in the window displays and give you a poster somewhere. You have to be seen. My mum always says, like, you can sell a worm if you promote it enough. So, like, you have to be seen. And if no one's seeing you, then you get that argument of, or not that argument, I say the submission. You get the submission of, oh, well, these sort of books don't sell. Well, of course they're not going to sell if you're not putting it out there. It's like, exactly. What do you expect? You can't you can't expect people to do it by telepathy to absorb it.
There you go. Is that an original for your mum, by the way? I like that one.
That's her. I should trademark it. Because she's looking at me, her daughter, now an author, writing these books. And the thing is, I'm not saying it's a disconnect. Like, if you don't know, you don't know. So I always say our entire view of publishing, and before you come into it, it's based on what you see. And I say most of what you see is a completely unrealistic view of like what you see on TV. It's only when you get in it, or you're then surrounding yourself with people who are in it, whether it's in terms of writers or editors, then you realize what publishing is really all about. And there's an assumption, especially like I think for debuts, always with debuts, there's an assumption because someone said, okay, I want your book and we're going to give you money for your book. Automatically you're thinking, oh, they want my book, they want me, they're giving me, regardless of how much money it is, now they're going to promote my book. They're going to give me the billboard posters. I'm going to get the tube posters. I'm going to have a TV, all this stuff. It might be unrealistic, but you're expecting all that stuff. And the reality is it doesn't happen a lot of the time.
I think your expectations way outside of mine. Yeah, which way is them entirely.
I am not the only one.
Dream big. Well, I will say one of the frustrating aspects of not being visible. As a teacher, I remember for years teaching GCSE and A-level, and the curriculum was absolutely dire, especially for Black boys in the classroom. Nothing reflected their experience. And this book, I mean, I often smile at some of the characters in the book, and I think of some of my former students who I know would identify with some of these guys and would vie, if you like, to rep different people in the book. And I keep thinking that's such a shame. They'll never get to know all these characters. They'll never get to see this book unless, of course, obviously, it gathers some kind of a following and people get to know it. And I think from what you and I have discussed about this, the hegemony of this dominant idea of what Windrush is and the paucity of information and where people came from, I think ultimately these stories need to get into our community as much as the wider community, because a lot of our people aren't seeing or understanding the journey of their immediate ancestors because they're not getting access to it. And I think this, in a way, there's a responsibility on us as storytellers to tell these stories, but then the next step is people have to do their bit and step up and make sure these stories reach the people they're meant to get to, as well as the wider community. Yeah.
This is why I think it's lovely to have, to appear at the big literary festivals. Like, it's always amazing to be on those platforms, but I really think it's important.
Well, I wouldn't know.
Well, I'm saying.
I take your word on that. Keep going.
No, but it's always going to be an ego boost, and it's always going to be great to be on those platforms. But I think it's equally even more important to have smaller events in the community. So it'd be like local book festivals or events in your library, because then you're most likely to get the people from within. They're most likely to go to an event in the library than they are to find the money to book a train ticket to Cheltenham and then pay the ticket for, all of these things. I always think it's so important to do these small events in the community, because I remember I did one there where I live, and it was a Saturday, and we just had people, we did this panel, but we had people walking in, like when they were doing their shopping in the market, like these West Indian women who look like mummy of my aunties, like coming in and like talking to me, like, what do you do? So I had to tell them what I did, and I had to tell them about my book. And so I talk, and they're like, oh yeah, they say now they have their little book club and things. And I think it's important to do that and to have those spaces. And because if you don't, you're always going to have that big, massive gulf between us writing the books and then them being seen.
Yeah, I think that's valid. I think that's a good point. I think we are looking for a mixture of audiences. And I mean, one of my hopes for the book, I very much hope it ends up being the film option is taken up, because I think as well, not only would it make a beautiful film, I think it would in many ways provide a type of heroine for people who don't necessarily see themselves in that way on the screen often enough. And again, it's a quicker access, if you like, to the people who would then go off and read the book, because of the nature of film and the way that the diaspora responds when they see themselves on screen. I think that's another way, hopefully, if I'm so fortunate, hopefully it will be another way in, as well as trying to get to people via local events curated for them. But I do think the book has much wider appeal based on the feedback I've been getting from people who are basically saying, we never even wondered about this, that people lived like this, that they went to church like this, that they had the types of formal manners around how they spoke to each other. And I say spoke, probably is still the case, they speak, because there's a lot of civility in those Caribbean communities where people are very respectful and very appropriate. You're smiling, Nadine. And
I know I'm smiling because
you recognize some of this. Yeah. So I think as well that's appealing to a wider audience, and it's hopefully, fingers crossed, that you may yet meet that audience for them to determine just how interested they are.
The reason why I was smiling, because my copy of your book hasn't arrived, so I was reading the sample, and it's when the girl, she says Tanti, and I'm like, yeah, we always say Tanti.
Yes.
Which is auntie. So there's that. And a civility thing as well. Like I say, in Grenada, my mum had a restaurant, and not even nothing to do with the restaurant. If you see someone passing on the street, it's always good morning, good afternoon,
Always.
good night. Yeah, always good night. Yeah. And then you'd come back, and if someone says hello to me, I'm like, good morning. And I remember my friend goes, is that right? And I said, because that's what we do. You acknowledge people. You don't just walk past them in the street. You don't need to know them or have a prior association with them. You see someone walking, good night, and then you keep it moving. So that's why I was smiling.
Yeah, I mean, I heard Derek Walcott talk about this once, and I thought, I recognize that more or less the way you recognize what I was saying. It's basically, it's like, who do you think you are? You may be a big man abroad and a big time writer. You still say good morning to everybody when you're down here.
Exactly.
And I think that's his sentiment. That's the way he was speaking to it. And I thought, yeah, we all know what that feels like. So there is that aspect. I think most people outside of the community have no clue of that degree of formality. I think people think everybody in the Caribbean are pretty casual and it's a bit laissez-faire. It's no such thing.
No.
So that too, I find, is just a little bit intriguing and something to share with the rest of the wider community. Yeah.
And it's always interesting because you'll always, if you're reading something like a little article or someone's blog about coming to London, they're like, oh no, people don't say hello to each other. They don't say good morning, don't say good afternoon. I always think, what we do. We do in Grenada, we do in the Caribbean, we always say, there's always that acknowledgement of someone. Which piece of advice do you wish you'd been told earlier in your career?
In my career?
Yeah, in your writing career so far.
Okay. Because I taught for a long time and I'm so used to reading other people's work and having to grade other people's work. I've always been extremely critical of my own work. I cannot think of, first of all, I don't think I've ever been given any advice, so I don't think that I subsequently received any advice that was golden. The only thing I would say, if in terms of communicating to someone else what's valuable about preparing yourself to write and carrying on writing is, I know it sounds like a cliche, but you really need to read a lot. And don't limit yourself. I mean, I read a lot of books in translation because what I'm looking for isn't being published. I need to be arrested by things. I need to maybe see a different treatment from a lot of the way things are being done. I don't mean to suggest that the landscape is in any way homogenous and everyone's writing about the same things. But I think it's important to have a broad menu and offer. And I read a lot of stuff, in a lot of nonfiction as well, a lot of poetry. That would be my only advice. It's not necessarily saying you're going to write like these other people, but it's almost you're orientating yourself towards who you will be as a writer by virtue of it's engaging with other writers. It's the best way of talking with other people who are interested in what you do and do what you do. It's family.
No, I think that one of the best parts, I've said it before, one of the best parts of this whole writing journey, obviously seeing your book out there, but it's the people I've met and become the other writers I've become friends with, and they become that support system for you as well, which is so important. It doesn't really matter at what point you come into the industry, whether you come into it at 20 years old or 40 or 60. It's so important to have this support system with you to help guide you, but also to listen to you when you're having a moment because you can't get a chapter at work. Because they understand that process.
Absolutely. As I say, we're family, we're kin. Whether or not other people use that language, that's the way I feel about it. And don't limit yourself to living writers either. That's the beauty of books.
most
You
definitely.
can be in
So,
company with people who are gone.
I have a question for you. So I don't get to ask you the very last one. So before I go into your last three, how do you feel about book banning in America as an educator, as a reader, as a writer? Because I know how it makes me feel whenever I see a news article about it or hear that a school is putting restrictions on what books should be in the library.
First of all, it's just reaffirming for me how powerful the written word is. I mean, it's so dangerous that people have to tear it down and hide it away and burn it and so on. And so there's that aspect to it. It's affirmation of how books can change people's lives, especially in the case of young people. If you're isolated, if you're troubled, you're looking for a connection. And a book can do that for you. How do I feel when I see them banned? Oh, that's a very, very disturbing thing to see. It points to so much is going wrong in the society as a whole. When it comes to that point, it's really basically saying, I cannot countenance you having a different view from me. It's very much a control thing, a fear thing. That's what I think when I see it. But a lot of stuff is happening in that particular country at the moment. A lot of division. So I think it plays into that. And I don't know, I wouldn't make too much of it in isolation from that. I think context is everything. I don't think we have that here at the moment, but it usually points to something bigger and broader in the society and in the politics.
I always think as well, though, the minute you tell to a child, you can't have it, the first thing they're going to do is find a way to get it. So I just feel like, all your attempts to ban it, you're just lighting a fire under a child to be like, let me seek out what it is that you don't want me to learn about. And then
I know it's a badge of honor, isn't it? It's a badge of honor for some writers to be banned by certain regimes. I think I saw something fleetingly in The Guardian yesterday about somebody who's chuffed that Putin has banned one of his books. So
I kind of would be like, I would be of two minds. I would be like, bloody cheek, how dare you ban my book? And then my other school of thought would be, oh, you banned me, really? Okay. Let me put that on my website. All right. So Anne, are you an introvert or extrovert or a hybrid of the two?
Oh, gosh, I'm definitely an introvert. I'm an introvert who's very able at rising to the occasion. But given the option, I'd rather crawl back into my hermit lodge. No.
Okay. What challenge or experience in your life shaped you the most?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that I've been thinking about that, and it's not just because of the book I've written, but it struck me. I thought, gosh, migration. I mean, I was brought up in the Caribbean, in East London, on the west coast of British Columbia. It's like, wow, how could that not have shaped me? I think it gave me a sense, a lasting sense of how insecure and temporary things can be. And ultimately, that's the nature of existence for everybody. So it was part and parcel of my upbringing, but I think it prepared me for the uncertainties of living, really.
If you could go back to when you were 25 years old and give yourself one piece of advice, what would it be?
That there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong with you. I mean, I was always this quirky kid, and I was always, very early on, my sister coined this phrase for me. She would call me contrarias, and that more or less stuck. I was always that person who didn't want to do what everybody else was doing. But you get to a point where you think, I want to be like everybody else. And you think, you're not like everybody, but I still want to try. So that's what I would say, just accept it. You're not like everybody else. And it's probably best not to waste too much time thinking there's something wrong. It's okay. There's nothing wrong.
So my last question for you, Anne Hawke, is What is next for you on your writing journey?
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of percolating something at the moment. I'm one of these writers who I like to plot, I like to shape and structure a work before well, that's not true. I was going to say before I start. That's not true. I'm at a stage now. It's a kind of a liminal stage for me where I'm between what is firm and concrete and absolute in what I want to do next. And then there are other bits that are just on the horizon. So I like to wait until everything comes together before I determine how the overall look and shape will be. Within reason. I mean, I'm not a perfectionist. I learn a lot as I journey along the way. So at the moment, I have a very strong sense of what I want to do next, but I know I have to wait for a few other things to arrive before I map it out.
I've wanted to ask you, because I could just talk to you forever, but I wanted to ask you, what has this experience taught you about yourself?
That I am indeed a bit of an oddball. I'm a bit different. I didn't need it to be writ large. I know that already, but it's been such an interesting journey. And for a lot of the time since I was little, I spent a lot of time reading people and intuiting things. And that continues. And just to see how possibly more different I am from other people who are writing, who are on the publishing circuit. Yeah, I think I take a much more laid-back approach, and I am not particularly caught up with the idea of world domination as an author. I'm not seeking those big, huge numbers. That's pretty much what it's taught me. I'm pretty much myself. And I see that more and more every day.
I think publishing does a good job of doing that to you. Like it probably puts a mirror up to you.
Exactly.
It shows you what you want, definitely what you want, but also what you'll be happy with. Also.
Yeah, and what you don't want.
Yeah, and what you don't want. So Anne Hawke, that just leaves me to say thank you very much for being part of the conversation.
And thank you for inviting me, Nadine. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening to today's conversation with Nadine Matheson. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Be sure to tune in every Tuesday for a brand new episode featuring more amazing guests. Don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a review. It really helps the podcast grow. And if you'd like to support the show, you can buy me a cup of coffee or sign up on Patreon. The links are in the show notes. And if you'd love to join the conversation as a guest, feel free to send an email to theconversation@nadinematheson.com. Thanks again for your support, and I'll catch you next time.